1 o'clock now. I think we might get started. So welcome to this ISBNPA webinar. I'm Maureen Ashe from the University of British Columbia, and I'd like to give you a very brief introduction to webinars in general and some housekeeping items to run the webinars as efficient as possible. As ISBNPA, we are extremely delighted that we can organize these webinars as an extra service for our members. These webinars are organized by the special interest groups of ISBNPA, including the newly formed Midcareer network. You can see a full list of special interest groups and how to join them on our website. And in particular, if you have any questions or would like to learn more about the Midcareer network, please either contact myself or Ruth Hunter. You can also view other webinars and recordings that are on the ISBNPA website. So as you know, the system that we're using is Zoom. In this system, you are all muted except for the speakers and organizers. This prevents noise and keeps us concentrated on the actual talk. However, for this presentation, we would like to keep it interactive. And so that if you would like to pose a question during the presentation, please raise your hand and we can either give you the ability to ask the question, or you can send us a question in the chat box. And if you don't have any questions during the session, you can actually still pose the questions at the end, and I'll go through and read those on behalf of the audience. Let's see. And also note that there is full screen mode. If you click on this icon, you will enter that mode. From our own experience, this is the most convenient way of enjoying the webinar. So on that note, what I will do is actually hand the screen over to our presenter, Professor Diane Finegood.
Okay, now let me, oops. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Thank you, Maureen, for the introduction and for the invitation to give this webinar based a little bit on a talk I gave some time ago here in Vancouver. So that talk, and I think this one as well, is focused on the notion of complexity and why interdisciplinary research is important in this age of growing complexity. And you can see my contact information there. I welcome anybody to send me emails or tweets following the webinar. So I always like to start with my key messages, and I have 3 basic key messages, or maybe it's 4. The first is that complexity is rising, and I think this is something that we all kind of feel in our bones, but don't necessarily articulate in a specific way. I'll show that in a second. Oops, I seem to have done the wrong thing. The second key message is that complex systems and problems are not the same as simple or complicated systems and problems. And with complexity rising, understanding the distinction between complex systems and problems is really quite important, and why they're distinct from simple or complicated problems. I used to always say solutions to complex problems are not the same as solutions to simple or complicated problems. But in fact, one of my slides will say that there is no such thing as a solution to a complex problem. So I've decided I better get more consistent and make reference to approaches to complex problems. And because the systems are different, or the problems are different, then the solutions need to be different. The interdisciplinary piece here is that this is a bit of a joke, inter, multi, and trans-disciplinary research is essential to solving the complex problems. One of my comments will be that we often are a little too caught up in our jargon, so that while there are distinctions between inter, multi, and trans, I'm going to ignore that for the most part and just talk about research that crosses our disciplinary boundaries. So my first point, complexity is rising. When we talk about complexity, the easiest way to think about what that means is think the amount of information it takes to describe something. That could be a measure of complexity. But over time, that really has been increasing. And as I said, we sort of feel it in our bones, but we can see it even in the world around us. Just think in terms of how much more information it takes to describe an individual based on their human genome, that sort of thing. And Bar-Yam, who sort of introduced me to this idea, argues that at some point in our not too distant past, we've exceeded complexity in the world that is relevant to an individual or that an individual can cope with. And so we've gone above what our capacity is for dealing with complexity. And it's becomes especially important that we attend to that and think about that. So my second point was that complex is not the same as complicated. And I think the easiest way to think about and reflect on this is that if you think of a simple problem as baking a cake, a complicated problem would be something like sending a rocket to the moon. And a complex problem, normally I say raise a child. In this case, because we wanted some element for the mid-career investigators that reflected these ideas in the context of my own career path, we'll say raise a scientist or work out our career path as a scientist. That's actually complex. So intuitively, you should be thinking, what are the distinctions between these things? You know, baking a cake is something generally happens, comes out the same if we follow the recipe. You don't necessarily need expertise. Sending a rocket to the moon, yep, it will generally work out positively if you've got the right expertise at the table and you've refined your protocols. There's not a lot of randomness per se that happens there. There is some. But when we think about raising a child, you know, rules don't necessarily help us. There's many different things that play a role in how a child turns out. And so clearly it's different from something like sending a rocket to the moon. So simple, complicated, and complex. So let's again think about that a little bit more deeply. Problem definition. When you bake a cake, it's pretty easy to define that problem, to create a set of rules. The same rules apply every time. That's the recipe. If we're trying to send a rocket to the moon, there's a little more uncertainty in it. And we need to continuously improve those sets of rules or procedures until it's generally repeatable without error. But raising a child, lots of uncertainty. There's no direct transference from context to context. One child is different from another, and anybody that's the parent of two children will recognize that what they learned with the first child doesn't necessarily apply to the second child. When you're doing something simple, you don't really need a lot of expertise. And yeah, we could quibble about that with baking a cake, but fundamentally it's these bigger distinctions that are important. Complicated would be, it does require a high level of expertise in certain areas. But when it comes to complex, expertise actually isn't necessarily all that helpful, and sometimes can get in the way, although sometimes it may be helpful. And the success of a particular problem that we're trying to solve, when you're baking a cake, if you follow the protocol, you're generally going to be successful. If you're sending a rocket to the moon, you're generally, you're going to have to experiment to develop the protocol, but you're likely to be successful after you've done so. But with a complex problem, success is really dependent on a different sort of mindset where you're adapting and continuously learning from your experience to continue to improve. And that sounds a little bit like complicated, but there's no stopping rule here. You're never quite done with the process. So as I say, let's talk about raising a scientist. So I'll give you a little bit of my own unique career path. Every child's unique, but every scientist's career path is unique. Myself, I started life as a basic scientist and an engineer. I worked for many years during my training and the first 10 years of my early career as a physiologist, doing modeling of physiological systems. I was in Alberta at the time as a scholar of the Heritage Foundation and there, so on a soft money kind of experience. I then, I moved in 96 to British Columbia, became a full professor, assumed the leadership or led a successful program project grant that was funded by the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation and what was then the Medical Research Council of Canada. But I was also getting to that place in my career where I was thinking, okay, I know how to do research, I know how to teach, I know how to guide graduate students, maybe I want to do something else. And I ran for chair of the department and lost to a guy who hadn't had a grant in 20 years, which still amuses me to this day. He was so bad they, he was booted out after a year. So in 2000, I had the good fortune and opportunity to become one of the inaugural scientific directors of the newly formed Canadian Institutes of Health Research. The Canadians will understand this was the evolution of our Medical Research Council in Canada, and there were 13 scientific directors, and I had the privilege to serve as the director of the Institute of Nutrition, Metabolism, and Diabetes. That caused me to really shift my perspective about research, and my institute identified obesity as its only strategic priority. And so I started to ask the question, well, what do we need to do to try to address that? And that ended up bleeding into my own research activity and started me interested in complex systems, knowledge translation, implementation science. And during that time, because of the focus in this area, I was actually an attendee at some of the earliest ISBNPA meetings, so touched upon the organization back then. Finished that in 2008, came back to SFU, but had a half-time buyout to run something called the Capture Project, which was Canadian platform to increase usage of real-world evidence. So really interested in how we learn from what we do, that continuous improvement mode. Then served for 5 years as the president and CEO of our provincial health research funder. And now I'm back at the Academy as a professor and a fellow in SFU's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. So unique career path, couldn't have predicted it when I started, lots of pivots during the time, but something that I've enjoyed enormously. And just to illustrate my sort of characteristics, you can see that in my early career, I was interested in things like the islet beta cells in the pancreas and how they turned over, found and discovered a wave of apoptosis in the neonatal rodent, which led me to an interest in type 1 diabetes and the role of apoptosis in autoimmunity. But then mid-career, I was working with others, and I put up this health communication cards as a tool. It was an award, it won an award. Oh, actually, it's not this one, it's a different one in collaboration with some other colleagues, but became very interested in health behavior and how we use systems thinking to address it. System Science and Obesity is about policy. And the last article, which is in the top 5% of altmetric after coming out last year, is really about the need to change the way we think about solving public health problems and the need for a new model of evidence, which I'll allude a little bit to later. So career paths are unique, but there are recognizable researcher phenotypes, I believe. So I think there's 3 types. I think there are mappers, moles, and mutts. And as I explain these 3 different phenotypes, I'd love it if the attendees would use the chat function and tell me, what kind of scientist are you? What is your phenotype? So mappers, no surprise, they like lots of data. This world of big data really applies to mappers, and they like to map out the whole system and how it functions. Moles, that's what we get rewarded for in academia, digging deeper and deeper in a narrower and narrower hole until I'll be, a joke here, we're the last one in the hole, and therefore we're the expert in that hole. And mutts are people like me, I like to say, we like to piss on every tree. So I'm quite proud of the fact that I have publications that span from basic science, clinical research, health services and policy research, and population and public health. Many people would say, oh, jack of all trades, master of none, but I'm quite proud of the fact that I can cross over those domains. So I'd love to see the attendees type into the chat function, what are you? Are you a mapper, a mole, or a mutt? Just so I know that there are people out there listening to this, please enter that in there. That would be good. And I'm not seeing anybody doing that. So There we go. We've got mutts. Oh, good. I'm glad to see that there's some mutts. A mapper and a mole together. Anybody else? Big mutt. Oh, so that's interesting. Lots of mutts in the ISBNPA. Definitely a hybrid mole mutt. So what I often say to young people who think they're mole or who think they're mutts is sometimes in academia you have to masquerade as a serial mole. Pretend be in one hole for a while, come out and go into another hole. Well, I'm pleased to see there's a lot of other mutts out there. So this is a group I can be proud of having published in a number of different areas and have you appreciate that that's a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. I thought I'd come back to this particular table and just sort of raise the question, what do we need when we're trying to tackle simple, complicated, and complex problems? So for me, it makes sense that when we move towards the more complex of a problem and a place where expertise isn't necessarily as helpful as it is in complicated problems, that we need more mutts. And so this is my commentary here that although much of science today and the way we think about science is built on complicated problems, not necessarily complex problems, which require high levels of expertise and which we value those high levels of expertise. On the other hand, as the problems become more complex, we actually need to shift our thinking and we need to find ways in the academy to reward more mutts and to recognize that that's actually an important component of moving science forward. This talk came from one in which we were talking also about interdisciplinarity. And for me, addressing complexity with interdisciplinarity makes perfect sense. And as you can see from this paper by Van Noorden from 2015, interdisciplinarity is also rising, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, which makes sense that the natural sciences and engineering tend to be disciplines that are appropriate for complicated problems. I mean, complex problems exist, but the complicated mindset works. So it's not surprising, though, that in social sciences and humanities, interdisciplinary is rising. This is another interesting graph from that paper, which looked at interdisciplinarity. So the axis here is citations from outside a discipline against references to outside disciplines. So how much exchange are there across disciplines? And it's really quite interesting to me to see that clinical medicine is down in the category which is less interdisciplinary, and health, which I think applies to this audience of ISBNPA members, is in a much more interdisciplinary domain where both people cite you from outside your disciplines and you cite outside the discipline. I think clinical medicine tends to be stuck there because of the evidence-based medicine paradigm, which is a very sort of reductionist approach to thinking about science. So I was curious a little bit because it's been a while since I thought about this organization and the kind of work that's being done. I went to the website and checked out some of the titles from the latest publications in the journal. And it was fascinating to me in two ways. One, I was attempting to show that you need mutts in behavioral nutrition and physical activity. But I was also interested in the paradigm that seems to be developed in the titles of the papers, where it's X and Y and then colon, here's how we do it: an umbrella review, a stepped wedge randomized control pilot trial, a mixed method study, cluster randomized control, etc. So I think that illustrates the effort that you're trying to make, in a sense, to introduce new ways of going about science that would be seen as acceptable in a mostly reductionist paradigm, but recognizing that you need new methods. And so I think that that's interesting and indicative of the interdisciplinarity that's needed in this domain as well. And clearly, I love to use the obesity system map. I'm sure many of you have seen it before, if not all of you, as an illustration of complexity. As a visual, it's much better than for example, the evidence-based medicine paradigm or social ecological model, because it really emphasizes the interconnections. And I think that's a really critical and important component. So Okay, so I've kind of talked about the fact that complexity is rising and that simple or complicated problems are different from complex problems. Hopefully those basic introductions make sense to you. And at the same time, I've talked a little bit about my own career path and how our career paths as scientists really are not simple or even complicated situations where we can predict where we're going. We don't know what's going to happen in the future and how things will change. You can hopefully see that the kind of traditions of reductionist science give us the illusion that we can make these choices in a very prospective and thoughtful way. But fundamentally, I think we should think of our career paths as complex and be open to novel opportunities and pivoting into different moleholes. Not fun and easy, but, well, it is fun. It's not easy, but really important. So now what I want to do is take the opportunity of having a group of participants from an organization like ISBNPA to talk a little bit about why the approaches to complex problems are not the same. And also to argue that we need to start developing way more empirical evidence about complex system solutions or about systems thinking. I think we're just at our infancy of actually creating and developing the empirical evidence that proves complex systems approach actually is better. And so I thought this was a good group, in a sense, to appeal to think maybe a little bit differently in the future. So our common responses to complex problems are retreat, despair, believing the problem's beyond hope, assigning blame. You know, we see this all the time in the media and even in science, thinking that we can have simple solutions. And I'm not suggesting that there might not be simple solutions, but fundamentally the way we tend to conceive of it is this way. And occasionally we'll galvanize our collective response and invest significant resources. Unfortunately, we're often investing them in ways which really isn't moving the needle from a systems point of view. So I think we need to really think quite differently. So wicked problems is another frame for complex problems. The people who get hung up in jargon will argue, I think, that there might be a difference between complexity and wicked problems, but frankly, I don't want to get hung up in that. But Riddle and Weber, who wrote a paper in '73 about policy, argued, and we've known this for a long time, that when you're dealing with a complex or wicked problem, there is no definitive formulation of it. They have no stopping rule. So this is the need to get away from solutions as language, although I see that they used it as well. Solutions to wicked problems are not true or false. They're just good or bad. They move you in the right direction or the wrong direction, that kind of a thing. There's no immediate, no ultimate test of a solution to a wicked problem, and every wicked problem is essentially unique. So this is the kind of shift in thinking that we need to start to do. Wicked problems can't be solved with a reductionist paradigm. I've been saying that already. The information that we need to understand the problem actually depends in part upon our idea for solving it, and I'll make that point in a second. The process of formulating the problem and conceiving a solution are identical, and every specification is a specification of, in terms of a direction in which treatment may be considered. And this idea that problem understanding and problem resolution are concomitant to each other is really actually quite important. So let me give you an illustration of that. So you've seen the system map. This was a version of defining the problem of obesity. In this variation of it, you can't see the specific areas that many of you probably work in. But if we zoom out on the map, which we did in a paper with Harry Rutter, we see something like this. So what you're looking at here are the main major domains in the system map: social psychology, individual psychology, physical activity, etc. And the arrows between them reflect that there were underlying connections going, say, from food consumption to physiology. And the thickness of the arrow is the number of underlying connections. So the number of connections people made between variables that sat in food consumption and affected physiology. So this is kind of a way to zoom out on the picture, but it shows us a really interesting thing. And the title of this slide is that problem definition depends on who's in the room, because one of the fascinating things to me in this picture is that the biggest arrow in the map goes from food production to food consumption, and there's no return arrow. That tells me as a viewer of this that there was a significant, I could say bias, but that there was nobody in the room who believed that food consumption drives food production. Clearly, nobody from the food industry or who works in that area had an influence on this particular picture, because people in the food industry, yes, they will acknowledge that things like advertising have an effect on food consumption, but they also would argue, and I think rightly so, that what they produce is a function of what people consume. It's at least part of the picture. So this definition of the problem of obesity clearly didn't have all the stakeholders in the room. And it's therefore one definition of the problem, which spoke to the people who were doing it in different ways in terms of policy. Now, you can use this kind of a tool, this visual heuristic of the problem, to start to ask, how do we resolve the problem? And back then, when this was developed by the Foresight office in the UK government, UK Science Office, it was also used for a dialogue across government. So the little regions you're seeing on this particular version of the map were the mappings of a cross-government discussion around which different departments in government were responsible for those particular variables. It used to have arrows to labels of who was, what departments were relevant to each of these areas, but because it's never been published, and I was asked to remove those. But the point being that a heuristic which accepts the complexity of the problem really does enable one to start to ask, okay, so where do I fit in? If it's me as a researcher, where are the things that I'm interested fit in the big picture of complexity of obesity in this particular instance? And how does what I'm interested in connect to what other people are interested in? And where do I need to potentially make connections that will enhance the work we do and help us understand how the system works as a whole? Now, so I've made reference to the fact that we need more systems thinking when we have a complex problem. So let me define systems thinking. An older definition of systems thinking, not that old, but kind of an original definition, came from this paper by Arnold and Wade, in which they synthesized the definitions of system thinking that came from sort of 5 main groups. And these will be known leaders like Senge and Forrester and others. And so their definition was that it's a set of analytic skills used to improve capability of identifying and understanding systems, predicting their behaviors, and devising modifications to produce their desired effects. I would argue that's still a very reductionist way of thinking about a complex problem. Let's take all that information we have and start to put it back together, integrate it into a whole so that we can actually go there. I prefer a definition more like this, where system thinking is about a way to make sense of a complex problem that gives attention to things like the relationships, the boundaries, and the perspectives. It's a mental framework that helps us become better at addressing these kinds of complex problems and helps us shift towards what we believe would be improved outcomes. But again, I'll make note that we don't necessarily have the evidence. So I tend to prefer that because it really is a much more integrative way of thinking about the problem in the first place, as opposed to still kind of reducing it to its parts and then putting it back together. So when should we apply systems thinking? Stubborn long-term problems, when there's many different actors or organizations, lots of causes and effects interact and influence each other, conflicting or competing interests, and no real single explanation for what's causing the problem and no single solution that's going to fit. So these are the ways, and I'm sure many of you are thinking about complex problems in the work that you do. When we do this, when we shift from the reductionist mindset to a more systems thinking mindset, then the problem exploration, as I've just alluded to, is not about isolating the parts. It's about understanding what emerges from the whole. And you may not even need to understand what all the parts are to look at what's emerging from the whole and to think about how we might address those problems. When we are thinking in a reductionist mode, our goal is to solve a problem. Here, it's often to develop a shared understanding across stakeholders and disciplinary boundaries. When we think about the nature of the problem, For reductionists, we think you can understand that objectively. Scientists like to think of themselves as highly objective. We recognize that they're not necessarily that, but we think in simple and complicated problems, we can get fairly objective. When you're talking about systems thinking, there's multiple causes, no single solution, and perspective matters, and there's always going to be multiple perspectives. So when we try to solve simple or complicated problems and we take a reductionist approach, we're, as scientists, often saying, okay, it's the responsibility of these people over here. But when we think in a more systems and integrated mode, it's really our responsibility to be part of that solution as well as everyone's. And we need to find methodological approaches that help us engage and address problems in this way. Sounds like soft science for some, but it's critical when we think about systems problems. So let's try another question of the audience. What complex problems are you trying to address? What is it that you're working on that you would say fits within the context of a complex problem where there's uncertainty, where expertise isn't necessarily the only way to solve the problem, where you need to work across disciplinary boundaries? I'll give you a second to actually just give us an idea. What kind of things are you working on? So not surprisingly, weight loss maintenance. I struggle with that on a daily basis. Childhood obesity, mobility, yep. Falls prevention. So a nice range, but obviously given who you are and what organization this is, we're talking about issues that relate to behavior, which is often nonlinear. There's lots of randomness in people's behavior. So all of these, again, are characteristics that contribute to complexity and a nice range of topics. Now, for many years, I've had this slide called Solutions to Complex Problems. Again, I'm editing myself these days, but what I'm not yet sure of is whether I should just call this approaches, or more recently, I've begun to think of trying to formulate principles that are appropriate to solve complex problems. And many of these are sort of there, but not yet well framed. But these have been collected from a variety of systems thinkers that I've read and followed over the years. And we don't have time to go through them all, but I will go through a few of them. I've already talked about the need to move away from the reductionist approach to attributing either causes to a problem, et cetera, and move more towards understanding that context changes, contexts are different, and we need to adapt what we're doing in different contexts. One idea that I think is really important, and I think it's on my next slide, let's see, no, not quite, is this idea that individuals matter. And I will come to that in a bit, but I'm gonna, I'll come back to this slide and talk about a few of these things in a moment. When we talk about systems approaches, one of the things I've found in the conversations I've been in with many people, including Harry Rutter, who I see is going to be a keynote speaker in Prague, is the idea that systems approaches, the idea of using systems thinking, really applies in multiple aspects of what we do. So it's in defining the problem or diagnosing the problem, describing the problem, however you want to frame it. It's important also in the way we go about intervening, what the strategies for intervention are. And it also is relevant to improving or evaluating. I used to say evaluate or assess there, trying to push the mindset of improvement. I changed it. But really, there's the problem definition, the intervention, and the evaluation, as you will all know it. And we can apply systems thinking in all of those areas. And I've tried to break down a little bit of what I'm going to say into these domains. So let's talk about defining first. We are used to defining problems, although this is speaking to evidence and what evidence is relevant. We can even see by the labels on the titles of the recent journal topics that this evidence-based medicine paradigm and what we think is the highest form and quality of evidence is still driving the way we think about our studies and our interventions. So we tend to define problems within the context of this and not necessarily based on expert opinion, but more on what we can learn across the data that we can collect. We shifted in this field to social ecological models. And I bring this up because I think this is a step forward, but I would also argue that there's a problem with the way we visualize the social ecological model, because although it gives us the layers that are relevant, it doesn't show any interconnections between them. It shows that they're nested, but it's actually in the interconnections, for example, between public policy and what communities are pushing for, that we actually see real change. So I think this is also potentially an outdated model for the science that's necessary for complex problems. Here's a different way of framing it, not necessarily the best way. I've alluded to some of this, but here's some of the characteristics that are different in complex problems. You have a more heterogeneous population. There's non-linearities. A leads to B, in ways that are not necessarily as predictable. There's lots of randomness or stochastic behavior. The system is dynamic. There's lots of interdependencies and feedback. And therefore, you get adaptation and self-organization and emergent properties. Now, I bring this here in this way because we rarely, in my opinion, define the problems in this way. The obesity system map helped to define that interdependency and feedback loops, but it didn't really necessarily acknowledge the heterogeneity of the population when it comes to all the determinants of health and that. And the evidence-based medicine paradigm tends to cause us to wash away heterogeneity and say, let's come up with the one common truth across a big population. In fact, it was, I'm sure, at an ISBNPA member meeting that I all of a sudden had this realization that we're talking, when we do some of the work we do here, in very small changes across a population to increase and be able to predict a little more of the variability in the population. But why aren't we trying to uncover in real ways related to behavioral actions what the heterogeneity is really all about, and think about phenotypes in different populations that would need very different kinds of interventions. I think this is the kind of work I'd like to see us do more of. I don't think epidemiology is helping us get there. It tends to cause us in the general linear model mode with the things that we can characterize like gender and age and stuff like that, to think in those ways. But why aren't we thinking about the heterogeneity of what drives individuals to change their own behavior or things of that sort? Another way potentially to think about systems is in levels. And levels here are not in the levels of the social ecological model, but in the levels in the paradigm of Donella Meadows, who wrote a paper a number of years ago called Places to Intervene in a Complex System. She wrote it out in 12 different levels, all, I think, highly valuable. But when we tried to use it from an experimental point of view, it was a bit too much. So we collapsed it into these 5 levels. But the point here is that we often don't think about what the deeply held beliefs are of people. And yet they're the most difficult to change, and they're the most effective when you can change them. We also need to think about goals, structures, et cetera, in this kind of a way. So this is another way we can bring some systems thinking to the fore in defining problems. And there are a whole bunch of methods and tools that are being developed to define complex problems, from the causal loop diagrams we looked at before to things like concept maps or network maps. I'll give you a couple of quick illustration. Here's a concept map we developed in some work I was doing around building trust. These are strategies to build trust. And each of those points is a different item, and they tend, through the process of sorting items, the 75 items that we had, into piles, come out in groups of problems. So this is one way to talk about the complexity of addressing building trust, trust being an important component of addressing complexity. Here's an illustration from some work in Australia, where they're using graphic artists to map communities. Here's an illustration. I realize now that this is being recorded, I probably shouldn't have included these slides, because in both cases, the authors didn't want them published in any particular way, because this is in progress. But this is work that Martin White is doing in the UK. addressing the sugary drinks levy. And this has changed from the version that he showed me that you're seeing here. But it was an attempt to try to build an understanding of the connections. Once the policy came into play, okay, what do we think the relevant pathways are for the changes that we're seeing? And they're already starting to see some really interesting reformulation happening even in advance of the levy. I just want to talk a little bit about the implementation and improvement side of this, and I've grouped them together because they're quite interdependent in many ways. So I've come back to this slide of systems approaches, and I'll just try to illustrate a couple of approaches that should help you shift the way you think about what is a system intervention. How are we intervening in the system? I don't mean the built environment per se, but I mean other things like the idea of capacity and complexity. So counterintuitively, individuals still matter when you have that big, messy, complex system. And what matters for the individual is that you match their capacity to do their thing in their part of the system to the complexity of their task, right? If I don't have the capacity to address my own, say, challenge with healthy eating, then I'm not, and it's very complex because I've got hundreds of thousands of choices and I have to deal with the cost and all of the other aspects. If I don't have the capacity, I'm much more likely to fail at the tasks that I have. So if you think of that obesity foresight map, each of the individuals that has a role to play in a portion of the map, it's important that for those individuals, you match their capacity to the complexity of their task. And you can change things by reducing complexity or increasing capacity. So this is an idea that could lead to a different kind of intervention than the kind that we have now. We probably think when we educate people that we're increasing their capacity, and sometimes we are, but it's probably not the most effective way to do that. And we really need to think about how we can reduce complexity. And again, I would say many people in this domain are trying to think about that as we try to live by making the healthy choice, the easy choice. But trust is also really important in a complex system where you've got lots of partners and stakeholders as part of it. There's different kinds of trust. I think we need to build authentic trust, not cordial hypocrisy, that facade of goodwill. And what's really important is that there's a relationship between trust and complexity, because when we live in a high trust environment, it's less complex to operate. So you can see that trust is an avenue to reducing complexity, and an important avenue at that. When we live in a low trust environment, then it's more complex for us to operate. So these, again, building trust actually could be an intervention. Just focusing on building trust and measuring it, but we rarely do that. Is an important way to think about solving problems. Building partnerships is certainly a part of solving complex problems. And here we often lump all kinds of partnerships together, excuse me, but recognizing that there are different kinds of partnerships and a range of them, and where those sit, and actually making measurements as we're both intentionally entering partnerships clearly in terms of these parameters, but also trying to make measurements so that we understand the nature of a partnership could be important. And Trish Greenhall's articulated her diffusion of innovation thing. What I like about this is the point is that in complex problems, we can't let it happen and we can't make it happen. We really have to think about how to help it happen. And you can see that the features and mechanisms for those things are really quite different. And we need skills at negotiation and knowledge transfer. We need to be able to influence people and enable them to do what they need to do, as opposed to telling them what to do or letting them figure it out for themselves. In terms of assessment, it's really, again, I've said this before, focus on adaptation, focus on improving rather than proving effectiveness, because just proving it doesn't necessarily mean we know how to improve things. Shared measurement systems across stakeholders are important, and you can see the longer list of items there that are all sort of systems approaches to trying to address and to make measurements in a complex system. Here's one example that I think is really important of the empirical evidence that a systems approach works, but it's really only one, and there are very few of these. This is a study by Lakem et al. Who looked at, I think it was some 30 or so interventions to address type 2 diabetes. And they characterized, instead of synthesizing them in the usual epidemiologic sense, they characterize each intervention as how many of the characteristics of a complex adaptive system did they pay attention to. So did they recognize the agents learn? Did they look at and focus on interconnections, self-organization, and co-evolution? So they rated each of their interventions this way. And then they also rated the effectiveness of each intervention on a scale of 0.5 and 1. And what you can see from the slide is that there was definitely a significant, statistically significant effect, the more characteristics of complexity the intervention included. I think this is, personally, I think this is a very important piece of data that says, yes, taking a systems approach to implementation, to changing what people do is actually can be very effective. But we need way more evidence in this way if policymakers are going to want to listen to us about a systems approach. This is a recent review that looked at system science and system thinking for public health. It's a systematic review. And what was interesting about this table is that there's lots of people calling for action, but very few trying to put an analytic lens or a benchmark to the process. We're still focused heavily on using modeling, which again, I tend to criticize as somewhat reductionist, as a tool to developing a deeper understanding. I think that's helpful, but I think we need to go much further. And lastly, and I know you can read this because it's on your computer, but this is just a list of items around active, healthy living that comes from a fascinating study by Brennan and colleagues, including Peter Hovman. They had the opportunity in the Healthy Kids, Healthy Communities work to actually develop with communities causal loop diagrams for their communities. And there are 49 communities and 50 diagrams that they actually then tried to synthesize. So the question was, what can we learn from looking at these each individual maps that were created in communities that were trying to address building a healthier community. And what you can see here is a long list of things. Again, not all of them are relevant to all communities, but they're really insights from using systems work. And this kind of a list could be used in the future when working with new communities to more quickly move to potential places for intervention that the community thinks is actually important. Probably can't bypass creating that common understanding, but it can be helpful. So back to my key messages, signaling that we're nearly done here. Complexity is rising. Complex systems and problems are not the same as simple or complicated systems and problems. Our approaches to these problems are not the same as solutions for simple or complicated problems. And I've crossed out this trans-disciplinary thing, mostly because what I think we need to do is transcend the boundaries of disciplines to develop empirical evidence for systems approaches. And I also admonish us for our tendency as academics to develop too much jargon, which makes some of this methodology less accessible to some of the people who work in community and we might be working with in community. I'll come back to that personal experience piece and for this mid-career investigator talk, and just remind us that things I've learned along the way in that kind of crazy career path are, it's never forever. I remember when I was picking graduate school, I thought, oh my God, this is the most important thing I'm going to do in the rest of my life. It's going to dictate my career. I walked into the lab that I picked after very careful effort. And the first thing the graduate student said to me that was there, who I hadn't met when I visited, was, get out as fast as you can. Great way to enter into graduate school. So I've learned it's never forever. Things can change. You can do different things. My experience of failing to be elected to department chair and becoming a scientific director of CIHR says that sometimes you don't have to do the crappy jobs in the middle. You can go straight to the top. I'm sure luck had a lot to do with it, but I'm happy to have had the privilege to do that. Sorry for the dryness in my throat here. The research enterprise, I think, needs all of us, mappers, moles, and mutts. And I'd like to see academia get better at rewarding mutts so that we can grow a larger mutt community in order to really address complex problems. And lastly, if you're young and you haven't got that secure position yet, you probably have to masquerade as a serial mole to be a successful mutt. And that process of coming out of your first mole hole and going into a new mole hole, it can be scary, exhilarating, but really interesting. My first opportunity was when I went from working on type 2 diabetes to type 1 diabetes. And those are two very different research communities. And the first grant I wrote in the type 1 area, sent it off to a traditional type 1 organization and got triaged. But I learned also, again, in this way, that I sent the same grant to a committee at what was then our Medical Research Council of Canada to review. They knew me, they recognized what I could do, and they saw it as such an important hypothesis that they ranked it #1. So don't be discouraged. Look for the home that understands what you're trying to accomplish. So I think the take-home message is sometimes you need to change the frame of how you're thinking about things or how we're trying to address problems in order to actually think in a different way about problems that are more complex. So those are all of my remarks, and I am going to stop sharing my screen since I don't think there's anything left, and look forward to questions that people might have.
So while we're waiting for the questions to come in, first of all, Diane, thank you so much. That was so informative and just a wealth of knowledge and insights. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. And there were different things in that presentation yeah, but I really enjoyed it actually. So there.
What career advice would I give my younger self? Well, I think I sort of said some of it there at the end, but probably one really important piece of career advice is that it isn't that the decision you make about X, Y, or Z, what graduate school you're going to go to, or what first job you're going to take, isn't the end of the world. Like it doesn't dictate your career path for the rest of your life. And I think certainly the youngsters of today recognize it. They're not thinking like old farts like I am, that I'm going to, do this graduate program and that's going to dictate what my research is. And this is what my career is going to look like. It really isn't the case. And and if you understand whether you're a mutt or a mole or a mapper, that might help you to recognize that you may be really open to other kinds of areas and issues and things like that. Now, admittedly, it's not always easy to do that. I've had some opportunities that presented themselves along the way that enabled me to be as mutt-like as I am. But I think, we have to think differently than the standard academic career nowadays in order to be able to do the work that we would like to be able to do and that we're well suited to. I think that's probably the main piece of career advice. And so keep your eyes open for the opportunities that excite you. Know yourself, understand what excites you, and don't get discouraged. Sometimes I tell young people, when you get that paper rejected from that journal that you really hope to get it into, sometimes you can go higher, not lower. So aim higher, because I've done that and it's worked. Go for a better journal. They might actually get it better. So those are other things that I think are quite valuable.
That's really helpful, actually. I have another question, something that you said that I'm not sure I've actually heard this in a presentation before, but it was about trust and measuring trust. And I guess I'm just sort of curious, wearing my academic hat, in terms of maybe this is simple, but how are you measuring trust? Is it between collaborators and teams, or is it also just looking within our participants who are joining our studies?
So I think the first thing you have to do is ask where within the context of what you're doing would building trust be a valuable thing to do. Sometimes, it may be, depends on the nature of the work that you're doing and whether it's with participants or or others. Where do you need to reduce the complexity of their engagement? Is it with partners? It might be related to partners and working with partners and trying to keep things from being too complex for individuals. So those are some of the things to think about. In terms of measuring trust, I don't know how to do that in a objective, simple, numeric way. And this is part of the problem. I'm good at calling out what we need to do. I'm not necessarily the person that's going to solve the problem. But I have seen, so for example, in the global health literature, there's a little bit more work in this area. And I do have a slide, but I didn't include it here, of a study that looked at trust between community health workers and individuals coming to a particular location for engagement with health services. And in that case, they used a more qualitative approach to measure trust, so key informant interviews and that kind of work, and definitely showed a relationship in that work between the trust that the individuals coming to the health center held and the effectiveness of the workers within that. So there are illustrations that building trust matters, but I don't have a good answer to how we could measure it in a numerical or objective way so that we could start to show that it makes a bigger difference.
Thank you.
So I see we have a question. If considering the social ecological model as old-fashioned, what would be the best way to understand the relationships at different levels? So I think that's a critical question. And I would say going back to some of those methods, like the slide where I had methods for defining a problem. There are a variety of different methods. So it really depends on the nature of the problem that you're working on as to what's the best way to develop a deeper or shared understanding with everyone who's involved in the problem about what the issues are. So sometimes it would be a causal loop diagram, and there's some interesting tools starting to be out there to help people build causal loop diagrams. There's a fellow, Steve Allender in Australia, who's developed an online tool for taking what's called a connection circle. So a circle where you write all the relevant variables around it, and then you draw arrows from, this one leads to that one, that leads to that one. And then his tool turns that connection circle into a causal loop diagram. So relatively easy to use. He's been using it in communities addressing childhood obesity. And he's told me that now the communities tell him to go away. They don't need him anymore because they're quite sufficient with the tool themselves. So that's one variation on the theme. But there are other kinds of ways to understand connections, be it network mapping, concept mapping, even that visual graphic mapping can be a variation of how you develop a collective understanding, because that's really what's important here, is both developing the collective understanding and potentially, in this case, understanding the connections between the levels. I hope that answered that question well enough for you. The glassemic acti is being suggested, which adds a little. So one of the things about that paper I struggle with is, it does a good job of, again, telling us about all the domains that are relevant to as we go through our life course. And it's a good read in that regard. But I don't think it's a model that actually helps us address complex problems. It still comes from, if I can say that, a reductionist mindset that we could somehow work out all these macro meso level things. We could see that as a function of time, and we could work out all these details to help us understand one person's path, because every path is unique. So while it's a good read, I'm not sure it helps us that well. And maybe I need to go back and read it again, because it's been a while since I read that paper. Push us in the right direction. I think I'm just trying to think what else I would suggest. There are some resources out there in terms of thinking about this. The Australian Prevention Partnership Centre has some nice, and I've taken some of my content from their website about systems thinking. They're working on developing tools. There's some work here that's going to be happening around developing tools, that sort of thing. I hope that helps. Mentioned that you criticize systems modeling because it is in a way reductionism. Are you suggesting that we need to do more real world community-based work, qualitative studies as you described without modeling? I thought that modeling is informing intervention development. So a bit puzzled. Okay, so I'm being overly critical. So that's the first thing, I admit it. But one of the things that I find interesting is that system dynamic modelers who've sort of come into this, this world to try to be helpful as it regards to complex problems are taking problems that are complex, that have heterogeneous populations, that have stochastic behaviors and stuff like that, and they're making them in a way just complicated by saying, let's see if let's take all these variables, try to get some numbers by them and predict where the system would go. I'm not suggesting that's not useful. Absolutely, it's useful. But it doesn't go far enough from my point of view. And what it doesn't do is say, okay, how do we actually think differently about the kinds of solutions that we're trying to intervene? So ideas like building trust, rarely, I mean, they may come out of a system dynamics model. I shouldn't be too exceptionally critical. But there's this feel for me that it's still making us comfortable. Like it's kind of the first step of coming out of a reductionist mindset and recognizing things need to be integrated. But I'm also trying to push us to go even further in recognizing that we don't necessarily need to understand how all the causes of a problem interact to predict behavior. We can just recognize that it's complex and think differently about the interventions. We don't actually need to know all the causes of the problem. And certainly system dynamic modeling tends to have us think we need more data to describe the problem before we can get to thinking about what the solutions are. So admittedly, I'm being overly critical. There's certainly really important work that comes out of that kind of work. And actually, from my point of view, the most important part of the modeling work is the process of building the model and a common understanding. So where you see system dynamics models having real impact in, say, policy and program development is during the building of the model and the uncovering of assumptions and the recognition of the complexity and all of those sorts of things. It's more there than it is in the actual predictions that a model provides. So, if you're off modeling on your own, I'm not sure the benefit of that is as significant as if you can build models with groups of people and do a more group model building kind of an exercise. I hope I haven't offended anybody who's on the webinar.
I don't see any other questions, unless you can. So if there's no more questions, then what I might say is that we may end the webinar there. Again, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Diane, and thank all of you for joining us for this webinar. So please join me in thanking Professor Diane Finegood for giving this certainly thought-provoking discussion, and it certainly generated a lot of questions, which is great. And thank you also to ISBNPA for their support in having this webinar here today.
But before we go, just because webinars make me crazy because there's so little interaction with the people, I wonder if I can ask one more question of the crowd that's still there to say, so what's one thing that you're taking away from this that you're going to think about that was meaningful to you or resonated in such a way that it might change the way you think about the work that you're doing? I just need a sense that that I wasn't talking to thin air or just to Maureen. So it'd be really helpful to see what you're taking away from this. I'd really appreciate it. So again, using the chat function would be great if you could do that. Give people a second to do that. So. It's okay to be a mutt. Yes, it is absolutely okay to be a mutt. It's hard to survive, but it's okay and actually a good thing. Okay, another happy mutt there. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, we need more interdisciplinarity for sure. I think that's absolutely the case. Okay. Yes. Yeah, you know, my friends at the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre did a key informant interview. First author on that is Sonia Witzke, who, if any of you know Sonia, she died recently, unfortunately. But she did this nice piece, and essentially the take-home message from that paper, where they interviewed policymakers about systems thinking, was the emperor has no clothes, right? That we talk about it a lot, we call for it a lot, but we're not actually doing the science that we need. And so I absolutely agree, we need to move beyond that. Okay, well, maybe that's all we're going to get from the audience, but thank you for staying with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, and thank you again.
My pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Diane.
Okay. And to the person who said they enjoyed the presentation and have lots of questions, feel free to contact me. I'm easy to find at Simon Fraser University, and you should have taken down the address. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.